Hey everybody, what's going on? It's the third episode of The Honest Hour, my semi-regular series where I try to find like-minded YouTubers and not like-minded YouTubers too. We don't want to create an echo chamber here. Um, Nobody really likes to talk to me though, so I'm stuck with Nathaniel. Hi, Nathaniel.
Hey.
So we wanted to discuss the relationship that the elites, with the capital E, have with Western countries. Because there's a lot of different ways I think you could look at the current political divide, the kind of globalist and nationalist divide. One of them is class, though, and specifically, I think it's maybe fair to say cosmopolitanite, coastal types versus maybe the more rural interior countrymen. And there's a very growing cultural gap between the two groups. So the first question I have for Nathaniel would be, do you think that's a fair categorization of the elites, or a fair description, or how would you describe them?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would argue that the coastal, sort of coastal cosmopolitanite versus the rural interior regular old American. Yeah, sure, that works for the U.S. For Europe, obviously, coastal versus non-coastal doesn't work quite so well. But yeah, the concept of city progressive versus people who actually have to make a living both in the city and out of the city. Yeah, there definitely is that divide.
Hmm. I think there's always been a divide between urbanites and people in the countryside. People in
Oh,
the countryside think people in cities are just lost up their own ass, and the feeling's mutual. I mean, urbanites think country folk are backwards and a little dumb. Um,
yeah.
but what's unique about this division, I think, is that the elites, as we've kind of defined it, are so they're kind of selling out. They're they're closer. They're more interested. It's the multiculturalism thing. They're more interested in importing different cultures. I think as a way to kind of get one up on their more rural counterparts. Would you say that's fair?
Yes. I mean, honestly, I think it's more virtue signaling than it is anything else. But the desire essentially for uh, to virtue signal and to show everyone how great they are, as well as the concept of, oh well, if we have more cultures here, we can have more cultural exchange. That's very much the elite concern, because of course the elites, which is the main thing that I was thinking of when discussing this topic. The elites mainly have a connection with people from other countries and elites from their own countries. All the elites from different Western countries and possibly even different countries outside of the West have more in common with each other than they do with their own countrymen most of the time.
How do
In terms,
how do you think that this has come about?
well, I mean, the most obvious explanation is, well, globalization. I mean, a lot of this has to do with the fact that, just globalization. I mean, if you have that, what's going to end up happening is that the people who are in control of the economy and the various people who are prominent within the economy are essentially going to end up, well, being more exposed to each other than they are to the regular old farmer or the guy, making the shoes. And those people are often more concerned with say in the U.S. American values, and Britain British values, and France French values, etc. So there, and I would argue that that divide is especially visible in stuff with regards to, as you say, multiculturalism. um, because there's this thing of, oh well, they're more accepting to other cultures. No, that's not the issue. The issue is more that they are so, for lack of a better word, fetishistically obsessed with other cultures, that they want to essentially, that they seem to think that their own culture, Western, and the various Western cultures, are
Hmm.
somehow not as good, or need to be multiculturalized, or that this is always been a part of it, so we need to inundate it with all of this crap.
Yeah, and of course the irony is that if you take all the cultures in the world and mix them together, eventually you're not going to have diverse cultures. You're going
Precisely.
to have, a sort of global monoculture, which is inevitable. It's not going to be a culture that's really based on any, I think, strong values or anything meaningful. It's going to be a culture that only unites people through the lowest common denominator, because you're going to have so many different people with so many different backgrounds.
Yeah.
In order to get them to agree with one another, or to kind of live side by side, you're going to have to kind of strip away everything that hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I heard some cracking, but yeah, the only way to get them to live side by side is to kind of it's kind of like the dark side of equality. People who care about equality, it's not that bad when they're really concerned about people who are suffering, but if you
Hmm.
want everyone to be equal, eventually you're going to have to go after people who are successful as well, uh,
Precisely.
because some people
I
do better than others.
and that's the great irony, isn't it? The main people who are protesting this crap aren't the poor working class individuals. It's the elite individuals who are having an enormous amount of success, either by virtue of their fathers, which is a huge problem, or by virtue of themselves. And they do it, of course, to virtue signal. So, but of course, obviously, I'm using the word virtue in two different ways there. But you understand my point.
Hmm.
The thing is that when you look at a lot of the elites, especially the California, Hollywood, or the SF business slash Silicon Valley business type, which are the ones that I obviously deal with most of the time, these people are out of touch. Not, and I don't mean out of touch with respect to other countries, with respect to what global politics. I mean out of touch with respect to their own countrymen, with respect to the values of the very country they have grown up in, live in, etc. They have grown around this idea that somehow there's Western culture and then there's other unique, diverse cultures. There's a lack of understanding that Western culture is not a monolith. They don't understand that American culture is very, very different than, say, Spanish culture or Greek culture or Finnish culture. In fact, by the way, may I point out that white supremacists make the same error, but of course it's for a different reason. With respect to elites, it's simply because they have basically grown up in an elite which has been homogenized within the West, and to a certain extent, again, in places such as the UAE, the Japanese elites, from what I know, have the same problem, although as far as I know, not as much, because of course Japan is very big on culture. The Chinese elites, even the Russian elites to a certain extent, although of course less so again, but that has to do with the fact that they're mostly concerned with just bleeding out every single penny they can from either the government or their citizens by corruption.
Well, it's also because Putin took them on some helicopter rides, so give them some credit.
Fair enough, fair enough. But you get my point. I mean, in most of the world, in a lot of the world that has not had a culture which is so focused around the culture, you're going to end up having this sort of what we're discussing now, this sort of homogenized elite group, which is what we have within the West, that does not have any sort of American values, a group that do not have any sort of values of their own nation, as it were, but simply just become this sort of bland nothingness.
Yeah, and I think the perpetuation of their bubble is partly due to the fact that they're so removed from the consequences of their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
When the whole Rotherham scare or I said scare, when the Rotherham tragedy happened, and you had,
Yeah.
I think, potentially thousands of British girls who got like
Yeah.
gang raped, insane number over the course of several years. I can guarantee you, none of them were like the daughters of any MPs. These were all
Exactly.
working class people who suddenly have to deal with it. And when they try to say something, they're racist or they're a Nazi. And it's cliche to point out, but yeah, I think the reason why they can be so delusional is because they simply do not have to live with the consequences of multiculturalism. And another one would be specifically in the case of America, a lot of the if illegal immigrants were competing for like journalism gigs at the New York Times, I don't think they'd be so keen on hating people who want to build a wall. Whether you think the wall in and of itself is a good method for lowering immigration,
right? Of course,
they prance around about how virtuous and how good it is that we allow virtually anyone into the country, seemingly with no stop. Despite the fact that over the last 60 years, you've had tens of millions of people come into the United States. And I'm sorry, 50 to 75 years, give or take, is not enough time to get people to cooperate. Like that's a very short amount of time in human history. It's simply not enough. And, part of me is entertained because obviously the majority of our immigration has come from Latin America. And I've always had a thought that maybe the upper class elites will start to sing a different tune if we start to get a lot of immigration from Asia, because then they're going to start getting out competed. And
oh well, why do you think that they're doing what they're doing in colleges with respect to? I mean, I'm sounding like a conspiracy theorist here, but I mean, there is a certain amount of this where basically they're trying to prevent those who are successful from being successful by virtue of good training by their mothers and fathers. Why do you think that Asians automatically get docked points on the SATs or on the ACTs or on the APs simply for being Asians? Or same thing obviously with the parentheses Jews, right? It's the same. It's the same thing. I mean, they don't like success because because essentially socialism, which is what they're aiming for, but under a different name with crony capitalism, is essentially a game where the person who's most successful is the person who can manipulate the government the best. And of course, they don't want competition from people who are going to be better, not only producing better products, but also better at manipulating the government. Because of course, again, as we know, crony capitalism is essentially just socialism under a different name. It's essentially the government trying to control corporations by doing various things, and the corporations cooperating with the government, etc. Again, this is another very good example of the elite being out of touch with the general working class. They're concerned about protecting their own interests, and their essentially jobs, their gigs with manipulating essentially the economy via government, than they are about actually dealing with the working class, the people who actually have to scrape by for a living. And the most interesting thing is the fact that a lot of the time, they do these things and then they have unintended consequences, with respect to sometimes they seem somewhat deliberate, such as the fact that Hispanics and blacks do worse at university because of affirmative action, because they're allowing people in who are not as qualified, and simultaneously the Asians actually do better in the universities because they're only letting in the very best of the best with respect to the Asians, thus actually increasing the racial divide within society, by universities. The other interesting thing about that, of course, is, for example, they do things which have other unintended consequences, which actually are, as far as I can see. For example, the manipulation of language, something which I'm very focused on, where, for example, by changing the definitions of the term racist, sexist, rape, Nazi, and basically ameliorating them and in linguistics, that's a term for basically adding on more, making the definition less precise. So, for example, what's happened to the word literally. But by doing that, what they've essentially done, by expanding the definition, they've been trying to make certain things seem worse, but instead of doing that, terms like Nazi have become ameliorated, so they haven't become, so they're no longer as, shall we say, what's the word, harsh as they once were. Again, and of course, when often, instead of doing it naturally, they try to dictate the way society goes. And society, of course, generally, it will do things, if you try to control it, it will do things through unintended consequences and it will go in directions that you never foresaw that it will go into. For example, this thing with respect to racism, sexism, et cetera, all the quote unquote neo-academic hijacked terms that are being thrown around these days. Now, of course, I have less of an objection. Of course, I do not object to all change in language, just to be clear, just in case someone's wondering. Obviously, changes like the word literally, which everyone seems to have a problem with, but, it's not some sort of enforced change. It's something where a majority of people have decided that literally is now an intensifier, not just, it can be used both figuratively and literally. At this point, it's being used in both cases. So, majority have decided, democracy has decided that's now English, even though I personally don't like the change. But with respect to these other terms, there were unintended consequences by virtue of forcing change in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to go back to what I said earlier, I think one of the reasons that they play these language games and that they stretch, the definitions of these words, past the breaking point, beyond all reason, is another way to keep themselves in their bubble. I mean, it can't possibly be that Donald Trump is not a Nazi. So,
right.
As time goes on, more and more people are going to be called Nazis in order to justify that delusion that there was a fascist coup last year when the election was over. And this is what's kind of very nervous to me. This is maybe getting off a bit in a tangent, but they're starting to move into the into a point of no return where they're literally starting to make excuses for violence. I mean, this is how deluded, this is how defensive the elites are about their delusions. Like, they are willing to say it's okay to punch a Nazi. There's been a long-standing American tradition of punching Nazis. And it's like, and I'm so frustrated because I don't want to rush to the defense of Richard Spencer, even though I've said a couple times I've got my sympathies with the alt-right. I sort of share some of their ideas, but it's like, listen, I really fucking hate Michael Moore. If I saw some guy socking Michael Moore in the face, I'd probably chuckle. I'll admit it, I'm not a great person. But you know what? I would never write an article on. It might have been fucking Salon. I forget which website, but I would never write an article, explaining that yes, it's a long-standing tradition of punching communists, and it's totally acceptable. It's fine. They hate you, so it's perfectly okay to assault them. It's like they're so afraid of getting their fucking bubble popped. They are, they're opening a can of worms, kind of taking the political divide that is in the United States and in other Western countries and ratcheting up the level of tension. And once you start using violence in order to settle political disputes, that shit will spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
Social inertia is, I believe, the theory that you're talking about. And yes, that is absolutely the case. With respect to Michael Moore, I mean, I'm going to have to disagree with you there. I hate Michael Moore, but I would never want to see anyone punch. I mean, that just doesn't, that stuff doesn't help.
Never asked for it, to be clear. I'd never asked for it. I'm not saying I'm violent.
No, I understand. I just wouldn't find it, even remotely amusing. But anyway, the point, and that's a fair point. And to give you a personal example with respect to this Richard Spencer thing, by making him seem, by calling him a Nazi, again, they're essentially making more people Nazis, and then they're actually, as much as they, for example, were accusing PewDiePie of, normalizing Nazism by making a joke at the expense of, it wasn't even at the expense, it wasn't at the expense of anyone. They're the ones normalizing Nazism because they're making Nazism seem like less and less of a serious thing. I mean, honestly, it's not all that serious of a thing. It's a very stupid idea, and it should be regarded as such for various reasons. But, by basically turning it into this horrible, horrible thing, and then, then trying to make more things Nazis, I mean, that's just retarded. But the problem is that, for example, there are people who would actually, if Nazism gains a foothold again, which it probably won't, but considering the fact that they seem intent on trying to make it so, I'm not so sure. The people who are going to suffer are not the elites. It's not going to be the people, the black people who are in the elite. It's not going to be the Jewish people who are in the elite. It's not going to be anyone anyone in a minority who are in the elite who are going to suffer. It's going to be all those people in the working class. And again, it has to do with assumed values and an assumed hive mind of the elite that they assume that everyone else around them has. The divide essentially is because they assume that everyone is like the elite, and that all the different people are not going to become nationalists because they've woken up to the glory that is a unified Europe, along with crappy economy, crappy system, essentially an attempted cultural whitewashing. But whatever. I mean, obviously that stuff's great too. But yeah, I mean, they are out of touch with their own countrymen often. It doesn't matter if they're Brits, if they're French, if they're Spanish. You look at these people, the intellectuals, the multimillionaires, and I'm not just talking about the multimillionaires. I'm talking about the intellectual class as a whole. All of these people are out of touch. They're inherently, they don't understand their own countries. Often they don't understand their own country's history or values or much of anything. It's kind of scary. And again, as you were saying, this leads people to assume, oh well, this isn't going to trigger nationalistic sentiment within people, and sympathy for not only nationalistic sentiment, which I have no issue with personally, as long as it doesn't, get violent, but ultra nationalistic and actually fascist neo-Nazi tendencies. And we're talking actual and not, the crap that the media and the intellectual class as a whole is spinning out of control.
Isn't it pathetic that we have to make that qualification now?
Yes.
Like, no, I mean
absolutely.
literally Nazis. No shit. No, not really. Literally Nazis. Literally Nazis. It's like fuck.
Yes.
They
Well,
ruined.
I mean, one, although I might point out again, one is actually a legitimate change in the use of the word. I mean, otherwise we would still be using the word nice in a negative connotation. But yeah, I mean, I understand what you mean. I mean, with respect to the Nazi part, I absolutely agree. That is that is a change which I think is very, very disturbing and which should not have happened. But there you go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, it's an attempt at controlling society because of assumptions they make about the hive, about the fact that they all exist within this sort of hive mind where everyone is competing for essentially luxury resources. I mean, it's again, they don't interact on a daily basis with people who are actually, the day-to-day American. Don't make no mistake. I don't interact every day either, at least not in person. I mean, obviously I'm homeschooled. I do interact with these people because, online classes and the like. But yeah, I mean, I don't get me wrong. I exist within this intellectual class. I just happen to differ in opinion and be much, more of an American patriot, for lack of a better term, than a lot of these other idiots are, than a lot of these idiots are. So, I know at least partially what it's like to, sort of be outside of the elite.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So you're a bit of a class traitor then, aren't you? Like in a way.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I really don't. I mean, the very fact that I'm homeschooled is enough to trigger most of these people. So there you go. But
Why would it trigger them?
well, because you see, they can't control what I think. I mean,
Oh, I see.
let's face it. I mean, public school and private school, especially where I live. I mean, all of these different public schools and private schools. I mean, they're all basically inundated with socialist propaganda or Marxist propaganda in general. I saw one classroom for Spanish when I was taking a test where there was actual Marxist propaganda for oh crap, what's the Sandinistas, I believe, in Mexico. And I believe it was Sandinistas in Mexico. Or was that another? I can't remember. You got my point. There was actual Marxist propaganda on the wall of the classroom. Just to give you, and this was in a public school, by the way.
Mm. Jesus Christ.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the problem is that, but since I'm homeschooled, you see, I can do whatever I like. I don't have to go through this stupid indoctrination. I was talking actually with someone who uh, seems to actually have some self-awareness. It's kind of amazing, in Berkeley, who commented that actually one of the things that she was concerned about was the very fact that people with even a slightly conservative viewpoint couldn't discuss their ideas in class without everyone basically dogpiling them.
Mm.
And I mean, of course, this is Berkeley, so that should tell you something. But you get my point. Again, the problem is that there is an out of touch. People are just they're out of touch with respect to what American values are, what has worked in the past. They're out of touch with history, as a matter of fact, because they want essentially to advantage themselves, but they also want a virtue signal at the same time.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. It actually brings me to my second question. How do we bring them back in touch? Did you have any ideas on what an effective method might be? Because I'm getting to the point where I just think, look, Sweden is going to have to become a caliphate, before
Well,
to the point where they cannot either they can manipulate language all they want.
yeah.
They can run away to their, I don't know, summer homes all they want. But when there's a big crescent moon in the middle of Scandinavia, they're not going to be able to lie to themselves anymore.
Yes.
What were your thoughts beyond that? How do we bring them back?
Now, I was going to make an edgy joke here, but I'm not going to.
We love
Mainly,
edginess here on the honest.
I know, but I do not want to besmirch the little reputation I have. So there you go. Um, I need to preserve at least a shred of dignity. Anyway, so in all seriousness, I think that the how to bring the elites back with my extensive dealings with people who are in the elite. By the way, I actually have known someone who used to work or works now. I can't remember, in Goldman Sachs, just to give you perspective. Um, Part of the problem is that I don't think you're going to be able to get them back. And here's why I say that. Again, these people have more interactions with people who are not their own countrymen than they do with people who are. This is a recipe for disaster. Culture would be a very big binder. Culture normally would be what I would suggest, calling upon values that everyone shares within certain cultures, but these people no longer share those values for the most part. Most of the time, they share elite the values of the elite, namely, essentially philanthropy, selflessness, but not only selflessness, but also at this point manipulation of essentially government forces rather than using actual, intelligence and good products to succeed. So at this point, I'm you would have to do it at an individual level. It's like what people. It always annoys me when people try to say we need to resolve poverty, and then they give you some government legislation or some societal change that needs to happen for it to take place. The problem is that these are individuals. This isn't some collective, massive board. This isn't. They have not been assimilated. They're individuals. What you need to do is you need to treat them as individuals rather than as a collective. You need to treat essentially each patient individually. You can make sweeping generalizations again about the elite, which is what we're doing here, and the observations which are largely accurate. But to bring them back, as it were, you have to treat each case individually. There are certain common problems, don't get me wrong, but you need to essentially pick away at one's soul constantly. And at the very least, make them realize that their own country is not, for the most part, in agreement with them on a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that they're actually triggering forces, the very forces that they hate.
Yeah, they're so obsessed with like far right nationalism, that they're going to end up creating the thing that they fear the most.
Precisely.
Not just I don't know.
Well, to put
But
out a conspiracy theory, I say that actually they're not. They actually want the white nationalists to come into prominence for two reasons. One, so that they can actually feel like a victim when they when the white nationalists go after them, because most of them are fascist, and the fascists and want to essentially just, in this case, funnily enough, destroy the elite, mainly because, of course, they're against the culture because they're race traitors for the most part, or because they're minorities,
hmm
or they want to do it because they want essentially the minorities to rely on them. They want to have a cause to fight for. Essentially, these people are, as the common expression goes, rebels without a cause, and so they're looking for a way to make the bad thing happen so that they can have a cause.
so you're basically saying we just need to like prepare the helicopters for I
Well,
came
that
to the same conclusion. So
not. I mean, I won't advocate violence against anyone, but I will say this: that it will be a very, very long process of essentially reestablishing moderate nationalism and a country-based nationalism rather than race-based nationalism, a nationalism based on values, a nationalism based on history, rather than a nationalism based on race, or essentially an exclusively multicultural view on the world and a globalist view on how people should interact with each other.
mhm.
Don't get me wrong, I like other cultures. I like traveling. I like going and seeing other places. In that sense, I guess I am at least somewhat similar to the elite. But then again, I also my values are not that of the Western elite. My values are that of, well, an American. But
hmm So you identify as a libertarian, right?
okay, I
Are you in like
identify.
the libertarian, family of ideologies?
I mean, I guess. I mean, I don't really use the term libertarian because I think it a way too idealistic ideology, and no, it is idealistic because mainly because what they want to do is essentially, for the most part, they tend to want fast change. I am very, very against fast change. I am very much in favor of slow change and of making sure that people don't rock the boat. I just don't approve of people doing it governmentally. But I don't think that the way to do it is to simply just slough off as much government as possible within the shortest amount of time, which is a lot of libertarians want. So I tend to distance myself from the libertarian label simply because I'm not, quite that. I define myself as a centrist leaning libertarian, if I'm pressed.
Okay, the reason I was just asking because it was I thought you identified as a libertarian, so I had a question for you.
Kind of.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's not really relevant. Toss that out. Gone.
Yep.
Hmm. I've so when you have an you say you don't. I guess we should have done this earlier, but just to be clear to everyone listening, at least when I'm saying elites, I don't necessarily just mean the top 0.1%.
Yeah.
I'm speaking really of the kind of upper middle class, essentially.
Agreed. No, I'm speaking. Well, I'm not actually. I'm speaking. Um, Not even upper middle class. I'm speaking more of attitudes. I'm speaking of an attitude of specifically people who are college educated. I mean, like college educated, where they're actively involved in intellectual pursuits in the West, especially in regards to, and not necessarily even in regards to science as much, but more in regards to stuff regarding culture, regarding cultural analysis, regarding cultural that sort of stuff. And yes, the majority is of course upper middle, but of course that's sort of a virtue of what's going on. I mean, there are upper middle class people who are not necessarily part of the elite group.
hmm
um Personally, I mean, I consider myself to be at least partially associated with the elites, not out of choice, but because trust me, I mean, they're a pain in the dulles to deal with for the most part. But I mean, funnily enough, of course, for one thing, I tend to be more international than these people because I actually talk with people from different countries who are, not the elites. And the people who I generally talk to are from Russia. They're talking to people from, in fact, the majority of people I actively talk to on a regular basis are from Russia, which kind of shows you how, much I get out over here. Funnily enough, I mean, if you think about it, the elite is mostly communicating with people in Western Europe and possibly, people from the Middle East because, business ventures of their fathers or because business ventures they're doing themselves. I mean, again, when I say elites, I'm talking about the 0.01%, but I'm talking about money, but I'm also talking about intellectual power, because the money, of course, controls the economy, but and of course government as well. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about government as well. And look at me, I like the guy from the Spanish Inquisition sketch in Monty Python, and the intellectual class.
Mm-hmm. So I'm actually glad you brought that up. This was a thought that I had. It's another kind of more tangential idea, but would you agree with me if I were to say that at this point, traditional avenues of intellectual development, things like university, it's far more of a cultural distinction now than it really is a way to distinguish who's intelligent or not.
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, that was always the case.
One of the things I've noticed, sorry to cut you off, but one of the things that I've noticed is that part of the reason they all think the same is because they all go to the same colleges. A lot of them go to take the same kinds of classes. And this is obviously a bit obvious, but this is probably a different topic. But I think it's part of.
It's obviousness is obviousness. I like it.
Yeah, it's part of the fact that college is now. It's not really a way to signify how successful you're going to be, either materially or how intellectually rigorous you're going to be. It's a way to divide people based on culture more than anything else.
Right. Well, I mean, that was always the case, though. I mean, this was the case back. Basically, there was a very brief period of time where that wasn't the case. Think about it this way: what are the SATs or ACTs, both of which I hate, by the way, or the APs even? What are they testing? Are they testing actual knowledge? Hell no. People who don't know anything with regards to math can pass the math test without problem. Same thing with the English test.
I'm living proof that you can pass the SAT math test without knowing any math. Just want to throw that in there.
Exactly. But here's the problem: you have to think in a certain way, and you have to essentially be willing to cheat the exam. Not literally as in looking at answers or having formulas written on your hand. I mean cheat as in find ways around the problems, not beat it down with sheer intelligence. People with an amazing amount of raw intelligence can do it, but really what you have to do is think in a very particular way. That's the issue. So, I mean, but this was always the case. I mean, think about who was going to universities up until the 60s. I mean, it was all people who were upper class. I mean, it was essentially training people to become leaders. That was the point of American universities. And in the case of English universities, as far as I know, the main purpose was obviously a little bit different. Namely, it was to train people to be a certain type of thinker. And before that, of course, it was mainly to train people to be good people but again, it was all for people in power.
Mm.
It was only for about maybe a period of 10 years, and I'm being optimistic, in the 70s and maybe the 80s, where that really wasn't the case, where it was based on a more meritocratic system. Again, this was always the case. This has not changed. I mean, the whole thing, I harp on about progressivism because it hasn't changed. The reason why the intellectuals are so authoritarian, so focused on getting more government control in society, more government control in the economy, the reason why is because of an ideology based around essentially the elites or the intellectual class controlling society, the economy, the country in general. That is a tenet, that is a core tenet of the original progressive ideology, just as much as it is the core, as it is a main part of the neo-progressive ideology.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the irony. They're looking at the modern progressives when compared to the old progressives. Is that the old progressives were some of the most racist motherfuckers you're ever going to meet in your life.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sanger, the development, the person who developed the first what was it? The
IQ test?
birth control.
Oh, birth.
No, birth control. Sanger, Margaret Sanger was her
Oh,
name.
fuck. How could I forget her?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was doing it basically to control the black population.
She she
I mean,
she called black people like rats that need to like be
oh yeah,
breeding.
oh yeah.
And now you
Got
have
a quote.
liberals saying that, oh, abortion is the sacred. Well, abortion was a fucking
Wait, do you think
social
that they've
program.
stopped being racist? Do you think that the neo-progressives have left their racist ideology behind? Think about affirmative action. What does it say? We need to help black people and Hispanics because they just aren't as good as us whitey without our help. I mean, it is a racist ideology still. Just it's racist in a much more condescending way rather than an actively hostile way. Ironically, the projection that they do with respect to these tests of what was it, condescending racism versus hostile racism, that's all because they do that. That's because they do it. It's not because they're actively seeing it in society. They're seeing it within themselves. They're seeing it within the very ideologies that they purport.
Yeah, I had this thought a little while ago. The white man's burden, it didn't go
Yeah.
away as a cultural trait. And
Oh
what
yeah.
happened was, the rhetoric used to justify the white man's burden, it simply evolved.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of it coming from a perspective that whites have an innate right to have authority over different races. It's more, instead of trying to play on the pride and hubris of white people, it's more playing now on the insecurities and the low self-esteem of non-white people.
I
But
would argue more that it's sorry to interrupt, but I think it's more manufacturing that low self-esteem within non-white people and then trying to resolve it. It's a classic cult tactic. But continue.
yeah, well, I didn't have a whole lot to say after that. It was just they really are exactly the same. It's strange on the surface because you think they would be polar opposites, but no, like the modern progressive movement that the elites have adopted is very identical to the old progressive movement
Yep.
that was at the turn of the 20th century. I actually have to get going in like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So is there
Okay,
any
fair enough.
last words you wanted to jump in? Sorry to cut it off a little short.
Not really, other than the fact that the modern day international elite is a pain in the tuchus to both me and to pretty much everyone who isn't within the international elite pain in the tuchuses.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about it.
Cool, man. Thanks a lot for
All right.
talking to me. Just so
Thanks
everybody,
for having me.
no problem. Just so everybody understands, Armchair Psycho does indeed support helicopter rides. I don't know if you guys heard it, but I just want to make sure before you close this video, he's 100% in favor of it.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
All right, everyone. Thanks for
All right.
listening to this video. Peace out. Take care.